Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I took a small break because I can't do these live streams every single day, and next year I'm going to be doing it differently, so it won't be every day. And so today we are going over chapter 15. This chapter covers the height of the Gilded Age, a 12-year period from 1885 until 1897. And this chapter will cover the administrations of Cleveland, and then Benjamin Harrison, and then Cleveland again. So Cleveland has two terms, but they're not consecutive. And uh, as I said, this is the Gilded Age, the height of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age started years prior to this, post Civil War. Some argue before the Civil War. But this is just the height of the Gilded Age. And this is following Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is now over. I have the end of Reconstruction being in 1883 and 84, following the civil rights cases, Supreme Court decision, which made Reconstruction and the enforcement of Reconstruction unconstitutional. And you also have other minor things like the repeal of the Ironclad Oath in 1884. So 1885, beginning with Cleveland, and then ending with Cleveland in his second term. And so this chapter, like all the other chapters, is divided into sections. And this particular chapter is divided into three sections. The first section covers the first Cleveland term from 1885 to 1889. The next section, called Billion Dollar Congress, covers the Benjamin Harrison administration from 1889 to 1893. And then the Gilded Crisis is going to be Cleveland's second term, 1893 until 1897. So let's go right into it. Each section, as you can see, has its own interactive timeline. And I'm going to be showing you what primary source documents and events that we include in the timeline. So here's a little description that I wrote for this section. This is Cleveland's first administration marked a rare return to reform-minded governance as he sought to curb corruption, restrain patronage, and reassert the presidency as a moral guardian of the public interest. This is following the administrations of Arthur, who was pretty bad, Garfield, who was decent, but he didn't live long. He gets assassinated. Hayes, who, to me, Hayes is like the Carter of the 1800s. Decent person individually, terrible president. And then Grant's administration, which is the most corrupt administration in U.S. history, despite any competition he may or may not have. And before Grant, you have Andrew Johnson, which is also a pretty bad administration. And so the administrations prior to Cleveland are very corrupt. And so Cleveland will try to be a moral guardian of the public interest. So a Democrat elected with the support of the reformists, which are called the Mugwumps, Cleveland wielded the veto aggressively, most famously against fraudulent Civil War pension bills, arguing that public funds existed for justice, not political reward. His presidency confronted the tensions of industrial America, from the Haymarket Affair in 1886, exposing fears of labor radicalism to growing unrest over wages, immigration, and urban poverty. Cleveland pursued limited but significant federal reforms, including the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 to regulate railroads and the Dawes Act of 1887, which aimed to assimilate Native Americans but ultimately accelerated the loss of tribal lands. By 1889, Cleveland had restored faith in executive integrity, even as unresolved conflicts over labor, tariffs, race, and empire loomed over the nation's future. So we have Cleveland's first inaugural address, given on March 4th, 1885. Here is an image of that inaugural address. That's Cleveland right in the middle there. And so he emphasized honesty, frugality, and reform in government, pledging to resist corruption and special interests. He called for fiscal responsibility, efficient public service, and adherence to the Constitution as the foundation of national prosperity. Of course, what someone says and what someone does are different things. So, the whole point of what we're doing is to show all these primary documents, to show what people believed, what people said, on top of the evidence of what they actually did. And so we'll get more into it. So you have Cleveland's proclamation prohibiting settlementation of Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a very interesting case when it comes to native reservations. If you don't know, about half of Oklahoma is native reservation. And so before, or what established Oklahoma as the native reservation, was all the way back to the Indian Removal Act, all the way back during the Andrew Jackson administration. So all the five main tribes around the Georgia, Tennessee, Missouri area, the five main tribes who left that area went to Oklahoma area. And so Oklahoma is the native reservation, the main one for many tribes, especially during the Jackson administration. And so half of Oklahoma are native reservations. And yet, despite that, people were still trying to settle on that land. And he spoke out against it, despite a bunch of other things, like Cleveland making this proclamation on native grazing. So natives would not stick to their reserved land because they didn't believe that that was all that their land was. Their land was, the United States, modern United States, North America. And so they would graze outside of it. And so, on the same token of Cleveland being against white settlers in native land or native reserved land, he is against native grazing outside of that land as well. Ulysses S. Grant dies on July 23rd, 1885, of throat cancer, shortly after completing his memoirs. And I will be adding his memoirs, his autobiography, to the timeline, because I think it's a pretty neat primary source. As a Union general and president, he preserved Reconstruction and fought early battles against corruption. I'm giving Grant a lot more credit. He did not preserve, and I will be changing this. I wrote this before, a while back. He did not really preserve Reconstruction. Reconstruction was pretty much over, especially the military occupation of the South. That was over pretty much in the first year, second year of the Grant administration. So he didn't really preserve it. He enforced the Enforcement Acts, which came after the end of the Reconstruction Acts in 1870, which is the second year of the Grant administration. So he's more of the enforcing the Enforcement Acts rather than the Reconstruction Acts. And then fight early battles against corruption. There were some instances, some pretty big instances of corruption that came out publicly, that transpired. But Grant wasn't really fighting all that much. He was not a good president when it comes to organizing his own cabinet and leading it, making sure it's not being corrupt. Here's Florida's state constitution of 1885. So I'm adding all the state constitutions as well because they are important, especially in the first half of American history. Cleveland's proclamation on illegal enclosures, the Chinese expulsion of Tacoma. So in Tacoma, Washington Territory, a mob of about 500 white residents, including city officials and prominent citizens, forcibly expelled the city's entire Chinese population of around 200 people, driving them out at gunpoint and putting them on trains out of town. This act of racial violence fueled anti-Chinese labor agitation and exclusionist sentiment, was part of a broader wave of expulsions and massacres targeting Chinese immigrants in the American West during the 1880s. And so Cleveland will make a proclamation on this violence. You have Cleveland's 1885 State of the Union Address. Let's see, Presidential Succession Act. This is act was made after the previous administration with Garfield and Arthur, Garfield being shot. You have the Seattle anti-Chinese riot. In Seattle, Washington Territory, anti-Chinese mobs led by members of the Knights of Labor and local white residents attempted to forcibly expel hundreds of Chinese laborers by herding them onto wagons bound for the docks. The violence, rooted in economic resentment and racial prejudice, escalated into a deadly riot that left at least one man killed, prompted federal troops to intervene, and highlighted the intensity of anti-Chinese hostility in the Pacific Northwest. You have Cleveland's proclamation against the Seattle riot, Cleveland's special message to Congress on anti-Chinese sentiment, Cleveland's message to Congress on the Tenure of Office Act, message on labor versus capital. You have the McCormick Reaper Plant Rally. Excuse me. A labor rally ends when a police officer kills a demonstrator. Then you have the Haymarket Riot on May 4th, 1886. Labor rally ends as anarchist detonates dynamite, killing police and civilians. And the Cleveland's pension vetoes begin. Cleveland vetoes hundreds of pension bills over 8 months. You have Hickwo v. Hopkins. San Francisco enforced a city ordinance requiring permits for operating laundries in wooden buildings. But although nearly all Chinese applicants were denied permits, almost every white applicant received one. Hickwo, a Chinese immigrant, argued that the ordinance was applied in a racially discriminatory manner in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, even though it was neutral on its face. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled in his favor, holding that laws administered in a discriminatory way violate equal protection, with no dissenting opinions, making it a landmark case for civil rights. Cleveland's proclamation ending trade with Spain in Cuba and Puerto Rico. So this is one of many early, causes of what would be the Spanish-American War, which will happen during the McKinley administration. That I'll talk about tomorrow. You have the Statue of Liberty dedication, where the Statue of Liberty is opened up or revealed to the public on October 28th, 1886. And here's Cleveland's remarks on that. Cleveland's 1886 State of the Union Address. American Federation of Labor founded by Samuel Gompers and other trade unionists, breaking away from the Knights of Labor to focus on skilled workers and pragmatic unionism. It sought to improve wages, working conditions, and lower hours through collective bargaining and strikes, becoming the dominant labor organization. You have the Dawes Act of 1887, proposed by Senator Henry L. Dawes, divided communal Native American tribal lands into individual allotments in an effort to promote assimilation and weaken tribal sovereignty. While framed as a reform to civilize Native peoples, it resulted in the massive loss of native lands to white settlers and further eroded indigenous cultural and political autonomy. Cleveland's veto of agricultural aid to Texas. So Cleveland will be vetoing many, many bills. You have the Hatch Act, sponsored by Representative William Henry Hatch of Missouri, established federally funded agricultural experiment stations connected to land-grant colleges to advance scientific farming methods, passed to improve crop yields and rural prosperity. It helped modernize American agriculture by spreading research-based techniques, though its benefits often favored commercial farming over small farmers. You have the repeal of the Tenure of Office Act, which was passed during the Andrew Johnson administration and is what was used to impeach Andrew Johnson because he violated the Tenure of Office Act by trying to remove a member of his cabinet. I think it was the Secretary of War, without the approval of the Senate, and that angered the Senate, and they tried to impeach him over that. Now, the Interstate Commerce Act, pushed by reform-minded legislatures like Senator Shelby Cullom of Illinois, created the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, to regulate railroad rates, outlaw rebates, and require that charges be reasonable and just, while passed to curb railroad monopolies and protect farmers and small shippers from unfair practices. Its weak enforcement powers initially limited its effectiveness, though it set the foundation for future federal regulation of industry. So, the reason why this chapter in particular is called the Gilded Age, and it only covers a 12-year period, even though the Gilded Age, broadly speaking, lasted a much longer period, going all the way back to post-Civil War until I guess about the Wilson administration in 1913. And although that's true, this was the height of the Gilded Age tension of this, the politics and money and labor being organized to check and balance the power of money. And so that's why this particular chapter, these 12 years, is the Gilded Age, the height of the Gilded Age. You have Cleveland's order to return Confederate battle flags. This was a controversial a very controversial decision, so much so that Cleveland will countermand the return of the Confederate battle flags. When I say return, he's talking about, so in battle, in war, if you defeated an enemy unit or captured them, you would capture their flag, the flag of the unit, and then you got to keep it as like a trophy. Cleveland is returning these battle flags to, I guess, the survivors of those Confederate units. This was so controversial that Cleveland will countermand the return of the Confederate battle flags. The Bayonet Constitution of Hawaii, so the United States forced Hawaii to become a republic and adopt a constitution that is along the lines of the U.S. Constitution. Proclamation ending the prohibition of trade with Spain. Cleveland's tour of the West and South. I'll be adding more documents about what he said during that tour. His 1887 State of the Union address. Lucius Q.C. Lamar, sworn in as Justice of the Supreme Court. Lucius Lamar was a Confederate who helped draft the Ordinance of Secession of Mississippi. His nomination and confirmation was controversial, to say the least. Executive order changing civil service rules. I denounce the so-called emancipation as a stupendous fraud. Is a speech given by Frederick Douglass on April 16th, 1888, talking about how there was some sentiment about emancipation, the abolition of slavery, as being bad for slaves, former slaves, and that people were making the argument that black people as slaves were doing better than after slavery. And so this is a speech by Frederick Douglass speaking out against that sentiment. You have an act to arrange the International Conference of American Nations. And this will be one of many conferences, and the culmination of these conferences will lead to the creation of the OAS, the Organization of American States. It's like NATO for the Americas, although a lot less money is being put into that. You have the DNC and the Democratic National Convention and the party platform for 1888. Cleveland is nominated by the Democratic Party. Yeah, the Department of Labor is established, and then the Republicans will pass their party platform and nominate Benjamin Harrison during the RNC. You have Arbitration Act, passed October 1st, 1888. You have the Scott Act, also October 1st. Fuller swears in as Chief Justice. Melvey, I got duplicates on the timeline. And then you have the election of Benjamin Harrison. He wins over Cleveland. And I have this video by Mr. Beat. He has done a video on each of the elections. And so check out his channel. Subscribe if you like his content. Cleveland's 1888 State of the Union Address. Uh-oh. I need to be careful with what I show. That was the lynching of George Meadows. Let's see if YouTube takes it down for that. I gotta be careful because I have, starting around the Gilded Age, and even before, I mean yesterday, or not yesterday, but a couple days ago when I did the Civil War, there are images of the aftermath of battles. So, I guess I should have said this before. This project is meant for adults, not kids. And so there's adult themes, adult images, usually of violence. And so, and the aftermath of violence, like lynchings, battles, murders, and stuff like that. So keep that in mind. You have the Department of Agriculture in the cabinet is established. You have an act to establish states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Washington. And that is the first section of this chapter. Now we go into the next section called $1 Billion Congress, 1888 to 1893. This is the Benjamin Harrison, and it's called the $1 Billion Congress because this is the first time that the budget went above $1 billion. If you look at the budget today, the $1 trillion, trillions, multiple trillions of dollars, that's kind of very concerning, I should say. You have Harrison's presidency, which coincided with the high tide of Gilded Age Republican power as federal authority, industrial capitalism, and national ambition expanded rapidly. The billion-dollar Congress enacted sweeping legislation, including the McKinley Tariff, expanded Civil War pensions, the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, while admitting 6 Western states and pursuing a more assertive foreign and naval policy. Beyond Washington, the era exposed the moral contradictions of American prosperity. Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth defended vast private fortunes, even as the Homestead steel strike revealed violent conflict between labor and capital. And the Wounded Knee Massacre marked the bloody end of armed native resistance on the Great Plains. Immigration and race hardened into national flashpoints as the Immigration Act of 1891 expanded federal control over immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act was extended. 11 Italians were lynched in New Orleans. Ida B. Wells published Southern Horrors, confronting the nation with the reality of lynching and racial terror. By 1893, economic inequality, labor unrest, racial violence, and voter backlash against tariffs undermined Republican dominance, closing an era defined by extraordinary ambition and deep social fracture. We have Benjamin Harrison's inauguration. Proclamation prohibits the hunting of fur-bearing animals in Alaska and the Bering Sea. Yeah, proclamation opening Muskogee and Seminole land for settlement. Yeah, the tour of the South and Southwest, or the South and the West. Appoints Theodore Roosevelt as a member of the Civil Service Commission. Theodore Roosevelt will, of course, become a future U.S. president. You have the Great Johnstown Flood, which is what this image in the background shows. That's actually a train car that's been flipped over. Harrison addressed to raise funds for the Jonestown flood victims. Northeastern tour. During this tour, Harrison makes an address to the Grand Army of the Republic. South Dakota's constitution, which is their current constitution. First meeting of the Pan American Conference. This is the earliest recording of a president. I'm going to play it to see. I'm going to see if the audio actually works through the StreamYard to see if the audio from the desktop catches. So let me pull up my stream. See, I don't think you can hear that. No, you can't. All right. Here, let me see. Audio. Um. Don't know how to do recordings. I'll have to figure that out later. I was gonna play the this video so you can actually listen to Benjamin Harrison's voice, but I can't seem to play the audio on the live stream. So I'll work on trying to figure that out later. So this is a wax cylinder phonograph recording, um, and this is the earliest surviving audio of a sitting U.S. president. It features Benjamin Harrison speaking about the importance of the First International Conference of American States, commonly called the First Pan American Conference, which met in Washington from October 1889 to April 1890. The recording was made by Thomas Edison using his phonograph, which he had invented in 1877. Harrison's remarks were likely recorded during the opening days of the conference, around April 2nd, rather than after the conference had concluded, because early wax cylinders were fragile and often reused. Very few survived, making this an exceptionally rare presidential artifact. The recording lasts about 30 seconds and preserves Harrison's voice discussing American cooperation and hemispheric diplomacy, marking the beginning of preserved American audio in American history, which is pretty cool. And the proclamation of the admission of South Dakota, and then North Dakota. You have the Constitution of Wyoming and Montana are admitted during this time. You have the Gospel of Wealth, which is written by Andrew Carnegie, which advocated for a number of things. One, it promoted capitalism, but at the same time, it promoted a charitable outlook on life by the capitalists. So capitalists are supposed to donate to charitable organizations and causes, to libraries and research institutions, and places of public accommodation and hospitals and so on and so forth, to give back to the nation that got them wealthy in the first place. You have Harrison's 1889 State of the Union, Hans v. Louisiana Supreme Court decision, Dependent Pension Bill, the Sherman Antitrust Act. This is like the main act when people think of the Gilded Age and congressional regulation of it, of the Gilded Age. They think of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Act to admit Idaho into the Union, the admission of Wyoming, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. That's the same Sherman as the Sherman Antitrust Act. So you have a big issue in the economy at this time with the idea of bimetallism, where you have the gold-backed currency and also the silver-backed currency. And there was a debate on whether or not the currency should be backed by both. That's what bimetallism means, both gold and silver, or just gold. And so many people advocate for silver along with gold in order to inflate the amount of money in circulation. Because if you just have gold, then the amount of money is limited to the amount of gold. But if you add silver, then there's much more money. You have Harrison's message on banning lotteries. You have an act banning advertising lotteries. You have the McKinley Tariff Act. So tariffs were a big deal at this time. You have the Constitution of Mississippi, 1890, which is the current one. In the midterm election, Republicans maintained control of the Senate, but lost control of the House in one of the largest midterm seat swings ever. Loss of 93 seats out of 332 total, going from 179 seats to only 86. So, yikes, this is a pretty bad loss for the Republicans. You have Harrison's 1890 State of the Union, and you have the Wounded Knee Massacre. I gotta find the image again because sometimes the image link breaks if it's not an image that I've republished on my site. And so the Wounded Knee Massacre is when the U.S. 7th Cavalry surrounded a Lakota Sioux band at Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota, during an effort to disarm them as part of the suppression of the Ghost Dance movement. A shot was fired during the disarmament, sparking chaos in which U.S. troops killed an estimated 250 to 300 Lakota men, women, and children, while about 25 soldiers also died, many from friendly fire. The massacre marked the violent climax of the Indian Wars, symbolizing the U.S. government's determination to crush Native resistance and a deepened mistrust and trauma in U.S. Native relations for generations. So, yeah. And the Immigration Act of 1891, which extended the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Judiciary Act of 1891, and the Forest Reserve Act. So people like to say that Teddy Roosevelt was the national reservist for, the environment. No, there were presidents before Teddy Roosevelt who were creating reserves. And then we have the largest lynching event in U.S. history, which most people, when they think of lynching, they think lynching of black people. The largest single instance of lynching was actually 11 Italians being lynched on March 14th, 1891. Then you have the proclamation opening Indian land up for settlement. So this will lead to a rush, and I'll show you later, but this will lead to a great race to take as much land as possible from formerly native reserved lands. An address to the Methodist Ecumenical Conference by Benjamin Harrison. Harrison's 1891 State of the Union. Harrison's message on sending aid to Russia. Harrison's message on inspecting mines. Silver coinage. The Greery Act, which extends the Chinese Exclusion Act another 10 years. Harrison's letter to the Virginia State Baptist Convention against lynchings. DNC platform and nomination of Benjamin Harrison. DNC platform. The Homestead Steel Strike fight. During the steel strike, the National Guard is sent to break up the fighting in the Homestead Steel Strike. Here's an image of that, which is kind of cool. That we have an image of it. Not that the event was cool, but that we have an image of it. That's what's cool. Yeah, I'm not going to try to say this. The Idaho miner insurrection, where Union miners kill 11 non-Union miners in Idaho. Harrison's address on the Idaho insurrection. Harrison's address on the violence in Wyoming. We have an 8-hour act, which will regulate labor. Quarantine of 20 days for all immigrants due to a cholera outbreak. Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in all its phases by Ida B. Wells. So, if the reason why we include a bunch of lynchings in our timeline, well, we don't include as many as what we were going to include. We're going to be adding many more, is because of primary sources like Southern Horrors, which talked about lynching. And in order to really drive the cause, the anti-lynching cause, you simply have to show the outcome of the lynching to people, and they'll be most likely against lynching just by looking at the outcome of it, which is, of course, dead people. So I can I can understand why YouTube might. Uh, I mean, we're already demonetized, so because we're very the materials that we cover are very adult materials. Here's the Mr. Beats video on the presidential election of 1892. Cleveland, Harrison, and Weaver. And Cleveland will win over Harrison. Harrison's 1892 State of the Union. Proclamation pardoning Mormons. Hawaiian Queen that is deposed. Harrison's address to the Senate on annexing Hawaii, and the Panic of 1893 begins. It was a severe economic depression triggered by railroad overbuilding, shaky financing, and the collapse of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, leading to widespread bank failures and business collapses. It caused mass unemployment, wage cuts, and labor unrest, marking one of the most devastating economic crises in U.S. history until the Great Depression. Then you have the Gilded Crisis of 1893 to 1897. This is the third and final section of this chapter. And so this is Cleveland's second term. And so Cleveland's second administration was overwhelmed by the Panic of 1893, the worst economic depression the nation had yet experienced, as bank failures, unemployment, and deflation shattered confidence in laissez-faire governance. Cleveland defended the gold standard and limited government intervention, a stance that alienated labor and agrarian reformers, even as the Oklahoma Land Rush symbolized both opportunity and desperation in the West. Social unrest erupted nationwide, most dramatically in the Pullman Strike of 1894, where Cleveland used federal troops to restore rail traffic, reinforcing perceptions that the federal government sided with capital over workers. Beyond Washington, the era was shaped by mass culture and empire. The world's Columbian Exposition celebrated American progress, while yellow journalism inflamed public opinion against Spain over Cuba, even as Cleveland resisted calls for war and upheld neutrality. By 1896, economic despair and political fracture culminated in William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech, signaling the collapse of the old party system and the approach of a new political era, which will be the next chapter. So you have Cleveland's second inaugural address, and again, here's an image of that, which is cool that we have. The Treasury Secretary John Carlisle creates a backlash on his statements on gold security. Cleveland's address reassuring the public of gold security. Then you have the World's Columbian Expo, which was from May 1st, 1893 until October 31st, 1893. And this was celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus finding the New World. The expo in Chicago had over 27 million visitors from all over the world to view a dazzling showcase of human progress, art, industry, and technology. The expo featured a gleaming white city, a neoclassical wonder of electric lights, monumental architecture, and grand boulevards. Visitors marveled at technological innovations such as the Ferris wheel, a moving walkway, animal displays, electric lighting displays by Westinghouse and Edison, and pavilions dedicated to science, agriculture, and manufacturing. The fair also reflected the cultural ambitions and contradictions of the Gilded Age. It celebrated American achievement and optimism while promoting ideals of racial hierarchy and imperial expansion as both a spectacle of modernity and a statement of national identity. The 1893 World's Columbian Expo became a defining event of the American century to come. And it will be in the second Columbian Expo that will happen in 1901, which is where McKinley gets shot and dies. So while the World's Columbian Expo is happening, you have the crisis of 1893. So on May 5th, 1893, the failure of the National Cordage Company, a leading industrial trust, triggered a sharp collapse in U.S. securities markets, intensifying the financial panic that had begun in February with the bankruptcy of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. So, yeah, this is not a good time in the world of finance. You have Nix v. Hedden. Here's a Supreme Court decision and a video by Mr. Beat of the case. Cleveland's special message to Congress on the 1893 panic. The reason why the colored American is not in the World's Columbian Expo. This is a pamphlet written by Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, I. Garland Penn, F.I. Barnett, on the reasons why Black Americans are not involved in the World's Columbian Expo, citing racial exclusion, hypocrisy of national celebration, lynchings, and erasure of Black achievements. Then at the same time, you have the Oklahoma Land Rush, also known as the Cherokee Strip Land Run, opened over 6 million acres of former Cherokee outlet land to white settlers starting in September. More than 100,000 participants raced to claim homesteads, making it the largest and most chaotic land run in U.S. history. The land had originally been promised to the Cherokee Nation by the treaty after their forced removal during the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. However, under pressure from white settlers and the federal government, the Cherokee were compelled in the 1890 Cherokee Outlet Agreement to cede the land for far less than its value, paving the way for the 1893 land run. You have the Panic of 1893 ends as let's see. Yeah, the panic ends by October of 1893. Repeal of the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act. The purpose of this act is to stop the drain on U.S. gold reserves. This is a notable success for the Cleveland administration. The bill passed despite an opposition filibuster in the form of Cleveland demanded. This is a forceful repudiation of traditional party leadership. Colorado gives women's suffrage. Cleveland's 1893 State of the Union. First Treasury bond sale. The United States offers $50 million of Treasury bonds for sale at 5% with the aim of increasing gold reserves, which is of great concern to the Cleveland administration. The sale is ultimately unsuccessful. You have Coxey's Army March to D.C. Coxey's Army was a protest march of unemployed workers led by Ohio businessman Jacob Coxey, who in 1894 demanded that the federal government fund public works programs to create jobs during the economic depression. Coxey proposed a public works program, Good Roads Bill, which called for the federal government to print $500 million to fund public works projects and stimulate the economy. The marchers reached Washington, D.C., but Coxey was arrested for trespassing on the Capitol grounds, and the movement was quickly dispersed without achieving its goals. The Pullman strike, a nationwide railroad strike that began when workers at the Pullman Company protested wage cuts and high rents in company-owned housing. The strike escalated into a major labor conflict, prompting federal intervention and violent clashes that resulted in dozens of deaths and underscored the growing tensions between labor and industry in the Gilded Age. Yeah, Cleveland designates Labor Day as a national holiday. Try to appease the workers. Cleveland's proclamation of sending troops to the Pullman strike. You have Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act. Congress passed the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, which raises income taxes to 2% on all income over $4,000 and on all corporate income above operating expenses. Cleveland's pardon and amnesty for LDS polygamy. You have the midterm election, where Cleveland's Democratic Party suffers a historic defeat. In the House, they go from holding 218 seats to only 93 seats, from a 61% majority to a 26% minority in the Senate. Democrats lose the majority, going from 44 to 40 seats out of a total of 90 seats. So, we look at today and like the political flip-flopping, and that was going on all the way back in the 1890s. So, you have Cleveland, or you have the second Treasury bond sale. The second bond sale is decided by Cleveland to try to stabilize gold reserves instead of waiting for Congress to act. The purpose of this sale was to restore the gold reserve and maintain gold deficiencies until the new tariff can provide revenue. Like the first sale, this one is unsuccessful. Excuse me. You have the Cleveland's 1894 State of the Union Address. You have U.S. v. E.C. Knight. Supreme Court decision. You have Cleveland's message to Congress on financial recovery. Treasury's contract with the Morgan Belmont Syndicate. By February 2nd, 1895, the Treasury's gold reserves fell to approximately $42 million, well before the $100 million level required by the Resumption Act of 1875. After a series of failed attempts to restore reserves by issuing bonds and depreciating specie issued for legal tender, the Treasury negotiated a contract with the Morgan Belmont Syndicate to restore confidence in the government's ability to maintain the convertibility of legal tender into gold. The syndicate achieved its goals through a combination of purchasing gold from smelters, convincing its members to purchase treasury bonds with gold, inspiring confidence in bond and railroad securities investors, and unofficial capital controls by convincing members and gold exporting houses to ship no gold overseas. So everything is centered around gold during this time, which is one of the reasons why I call it the Gilded Crisis, because it's gold. Cleveland's message to Congress on gold security. Sadly, Frederick Douglass dies on February 20th, 1895. The New York Times reports on Cuban rebellion against Spain. This is one of many yellow papers that will come out, and Cleveland will be against any intervention and any U.S. involvement in the fighting against Spain and Cuba, but the next president, McKinley, will get involved. You have Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Co., a 5-4 decision. The U.S. Supreme Court nullifies the income tax law set forth in the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act. In re Dems, a 9-0 decision that the federal government, i.e. the president, could legally intervene to protect interstate commerce in the U.S. mail, and that the court did have the authority to issue an injunction preventing federal functions. The Declaration of U.S. Neutrality with Spain by Cleveland. You have the Atlanta, I think that's supposed to say Atlanta, so that's a typo on my part. Atlanta Compromise by Booker T. Washington. Cleveland's 1895 State of the Union Address. Mission of Utah to the Union. You have the fourth Treasury bond sale. You have the infamous Plessy v. Ferguson case. Cleveland's veto message on internal improvements. Veto is overridden by Congress. The RNC platform and nomination of McKinley. McKinley's address on his nomination. DNC platform and nomination of William Jennings Bryan. This is where William Jennings Bryan gives his famous Cross of Gold speech. It was at the DNC. William Jennings Bryan address on his nomination. McKinley's letter of acceptance on his nomination. And then you have the election of McKinley. Cleveland's 1896 State of the Union Address. Act on mining oil. Cleveland's proclamation on national forest reserves. And Cleveland's veto message on the immigration bill. So this will conclude today's live stream on Chapter 15, The Gilded Age, from 1885 to 1893. This covered the administrations of Cleveland, Harrison, and then Cleveland again. And then tomorrow, we're going to be covering the New Nationalism, Chapter 16, which is New Nationalism. And that's going to be covering the administrations of McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, and then Taft. So those three presidents. So stay tuned for tomorrow's live stream. Should be around 5 p.m. EST. And if you want, what I've been showing you is our charity's website. www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled TARPEIA.us. This is Chapter 15. Tomorrow I'll be covering Chapter 16, which is called New Nationalism from 1897 to 1913. And so if you want to be on the stream tomorrow, feel free to comment, to ask questions about the history that I'm covering, and check out our website. We are an educational nonprofit, 501c3, so all donations are tax deductible. And so if you want to sponsor an era and get your name listed on the page for the era, just let me know. And yeah, I'll see you tomorrow. So thank you if you were here, and make sure to have a nice day.